So why is it that the route to F1 and the opportunities for young talent is so limited, almost not fit for purpose when you consider how F1 finds itself in 2024? And also why are young drivers not getting the same chances as with previous eras, and even when they do get to F1, have such limited time to prepare in terms of testing and overall track time? So surely there must be a way for F1 to use this young talent to their advantage and create a steady feed of talent coming into the sport, which will keep some of the older drivers on their toes. Now, although I think young talent deserve a better chance in F1, I don't want it to turn into a creche, nor do I want it to turn into an old folks home. I just think that the best talent should be in F1 at all times. Because ideally, if they're promising, offer them a drive. But if they're not, that's okay too, but at least they had a shot. And there are some very promising names out there in Formula 1 at the moment, but are getting overshadowed by older drivers who are more experienced and also possibly lower risk, but also critically may have lower potential than some of these younger drivers. So with that, let's jump straight into this. Now, Formula 1 history is littered with drivers who showed all the tools and all the promise to be big and make it, but ultimately didn't. It's could've, would've, should've, and it's the same in every single sport. Now, despite what I said, there have been recent success stories. Oscar Piastri made his debut in 2023, with McLaren taking him on as a rookie. He impressed, and McLaren haven't looked back since. And now it looks like he's going to be with us for quite a long time. Rewind slightly further back to 2017, 18 and 19, and we saw Gasly, Leclerc, Norris, Russell and Albon all making their debuts, and all of whom are now established drivers. But that once steady flow that was delivering talent to F1 has now dried up, and it appears this feeder system, combined with F1's ability to facilitate and maximise young talent, is not delivering. At this rate, F2 and F3 is probably better defined as a feeder series to World Endurance Racing and Formula E. Now, some do become test and reserve drivers, but what that basically means in modern Formula 1 is that you spend a lot of time doing simulator work, and on race weekends, you have to stand around in the garage with a headset on, staring at monitors. Not really the sort of thing they would have hoped for, I don't think. Now, from what we've seen in the last 3 years, which was also confirmed just last week, the best way to get into Formula 1 now is as a substitute for a driver who can't race for whatever reason. And we've seen the likes of Nick de Vries, Liam Lawson and Ollie Bearman all making their debuts as substitute drivers. And that's absolutely fine. Drivers have been subbing in and out of the sport since the very beginning. But the issue is when drivers initially impress on their debut, whether it's a one-off drive or maybe 2 or 3 drives, but once they actually get into a full-time seat, they disappoint. The pace that they initially showed isn't there. Something isn't translating somewhere. Now, putting Ollie Bearman aside, we'll have to wait and see what happens there. Nick de Vries scored on his debut at Williams, driving a car which was basically a backmarker, impressed everyone. But he got a drive at AlphaTauri the following year and got dropped halfway through the season due to poor performances. And then you have Liam Lawson, who amazingly wasn't able to secure a full-time seat for 2024, despite some really amazing performances at AlphaTauri last year. Now, you could point to a variety of reasons for this. Perhaps in De Vries' case, it's maybe lacking that natural feel for driving a Formula 1 car. But in Liam Lawson's case, it's perhaps not having the commercial clout as the driver that you're competing against, in this case, Daniel Ricciardo. But all of these drivers, and there are many others too, who would have benefited from being able to do more work outside of a simulator, as in testing their car for hundreds and hundreds of miles so that they know it's inside out. And this was also a luxury that Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso had when they joined the sport. They could rack up endless miles of testing pre-season and throughout the season. And a very dividing question, of course, is would they have made the same amount of impact if they were subject to what young drivers have to go through today? Do let me know in the comments. And in addition to this, F1 is currently running at its minimum of 10 teams, which in my opinion should be 13, minimum 12. So potentially we are missing out on spaces for another 6 drivers on the grid, and that would be significant. And that could be it. That could be the solution. If F1 did decide to increase the grid to 11, 12 or 13 teams, the whole issue of young drivers not getting an opportunity could be solved overnight. Now, these new teams would be small in size, have smaller budgets, and therefore would be quite happy to take on a young driver who is hungry and probably isn't asking for much money either, and also has quite close ties to works teams like Ferrari or Mercedes. But even if that did happen, the young drivers would still be subject to a problem which we find ourselves today, and that is the immense pressure that these drivers find themselves under to deliver immediately, right from their debut, You could argue whether they've been given enough time and enough support to really establish themselves in the sport. But take someone like Logan Sargent, who's been given a second chance at Williams this year, and he's really got to show what he's got. He's really on thin ice at the moment, so we'll just have to wait and see what he does. And then if that still doesn't work, they are unceremoniously dropped and replaced by a more experienced and lower risk driver. The first example that comes to mind here is Mick Schumacher, and he had 2 seasons at Haas to showcase himself and really show us that he was at home in F1. But he couldn't do it. If you're fast and having accidents and wrecking cars, that's one thing. But if you are slow, not beating your teammate and still wrecking cars, that's just a death sentence in F1 terms. And there's also a belief that modern F1 cars are easier to drive than previous eras cars. But despite this, there is still a fair amount of adapting that needs to be done if you are to make the jump from F2 or F3 up to Formula 1. Adapting which needs to be done by driving the car over and over again until you're putting in competitive laps. And now this presents the problem of limited testing, which has ruined the chances of so many young drivers over the years. Because without testing, the only real way that they can improve is by driving the car on race weekends and effectively learning on the job. And yes, there are young driver tests which some teams take quite seriously, but also you do wonder if some of the teams are kind of having their arms twisted into doing it and if they're really kind of taking it seriously. Now, this is the tricky one here. When we see the likes of De Vries and Behrman scoring on their debuts and also Lawson beating his teammate on his debut, you'll always hear the same statement come up, and it is that modern F1 cars are too easy to drive. And that's something which has always been up for debate. And what fuels that is seeing drivers like De Vries jump into a Williams, which was a backmarker, and score points on his debut, and yet have an absolute disaster when he's racing in F1 full time. And so with that, you have to consider the unique differences between one-off drives and racing full time, 23 or 24 races a season. Now, the term beginner's luck exists for a reason, and I sense that when a young rookie is brought in to substitute a driver who can't race for whatever reason, expectations are low. He's expected just to basically don't crash, bring the car back in one piece, don't have any accidents. And also don't do anything stupid, but also because he's not being told you must finish in the points, you have to finish 8th or 6th or 5th or 1st or whatever, he can drive with a freedom and kind of express himself perhaps behind the wheel that you wouldn't be able to if you were committed to a full drive in Formula 1 for a season. And the way things are looking at the moment, it looks like Behrman might still have to stand in for Sainz for the Australian Grand Prix. And his performance there, combined with these lack of opportunities in Formula 1, could really make or break his career. You know, he's made an impact because of his amazing drive at Saudi, but if he arrives in Australia, gets knocked out in Q1, finishes last, or just generally doesn't perform, that could really change the tone for his whole ambitions in Formula 1 altogether. And then you have the pressure if things aren't going well. You've got pressure from the team, pressure from sponsors, pressure from the media, and also pressure that you put on yourself as well. You know, there's a whole load of extra baggage that comes with having an F1 seat. And it's this extra baggage which could break a once promising driver. It broke Nick De Vries and it broke Mick Schumacher. And it could also break Liam Lawson or Ollie Behrman if they got full-time seats. I hope it doesn't, but we'll just have to wait and see. And then you have someone like Logan Sargent, who is currently the most rookie-ish on the F1 grid, wasn't spectacular in the lower formula, so how he got the Williams drive for 2023 and kept it for 2024 is very unusual. Because another enormous factor for young drivers not getting these opportunities these days is that F1 teams are now enormous multi-layered businesses with thousands of employees owned by a variety of shareholders and big people at the top who we never see. Now, I'm not saying that Williams were pressured from the top to keep Sargent on, but I'm also saying it's not impossible. And with the size of F1 teams nowadays and everything that's on the line, you do kind of have to empathise a little bit with what team principals have to put up with now. Because they're held responsible for everything, even as to why they do or don't give rookies a chance. Potentially, by putting this 20-year-old rookie in your seats, you're gambling your job, other people's jobs, millions and millions of dollars. It could pay off, but the risk is enormous. So no wonder a lot of them are like, yep, we'll stick him in a driver development role, shows that we care, ticks that box. Meanwhile, let's hire that 30-year-old with 100 races under his belt. Big teams can also try and influence their minion teams to try and give their young driver a seat, as we've seen with Mercedes, trying to encourage Williams to give Kimi Antonelli a drive for next year. So surely, with everything I've talked about, there must be a way for these young talents to get an opportunity to drive an F1 and show us what they're made of. And you know what? I think I might have the answer. Take the current path for young talent getting into Formula One, which is badly flawed and needs improving, and then marry it to something else in Formula One, which is also badly flawed and needs improving. In this case, the F1 sprint races. By the way, please let me know what your thoughts are in the comments on this one. Am I talking out of my arse? Is it a good idea? Will it add to the sport? Will it take away from the sport? Just let me know. By utilising the sprint races so that each team has to use one of its reserve or development drivers in one of the seats, you are solving two problems at once. You're solving the young driver problem and the sprint race problem, and creating a product which I think would be genuinely interesting. So as I said, each driver has one of their regular drivers and then a young talent in the seat next to them. For example, Aston Martin would have Alonso and Drugovich, and Mercedes would enter Russell or Hamilton and Kimi Antonelli. We would get to see how they perform on track. It gives them a taste of Formula One, and it really shows us if they've got what it takes. I don't think it turns sprint races into a circus so much as some other suggestions have done, but I think it's a very natural and easy way just to bring these guys into the sports. And also it exposes some casual fans to some of the young drivers and would potentially increase interest in Formula 2 and Formula 3. Teams could switch drivers out, they don't have to use the same ones for each sprint race, but it would help these guys build a following. They would become marketable, build a fan base, attract sponsors, and look far more attractive to teams than they were before. And in time, who knows, this could be the solution for getting a female driver back into Formula One. Most teams now have a female driver involved, which is great, but at some point soon, they will have to follow through on their PR work. They're going to have to put their money where their mouth is. And if they have a driver who is good enough and she's ready, this would be the time. Now look, ideally there should be a steady flow of drivers in and a steady flow of drivers out. And because we haven't had that steady flow of drivers coming into the sport, it means that we've got a few drivers kind of hanging around on overtime. To be honest, the quickest solution to all this, I think, is going to be the sheer number of drivers that are going to be out of contract by the end of this season. I think we'll see a very fresh and new looking grid by the start of 2025 when you look at the sheer amount of talent available and what could potentially come in versus the drivers that are kind of hanging around, resting on their laurels, not doing much. There's huge scope for a bit of a refresh and a bit of a reset and a kind of new era perhaps to F1 in 2025. So anyway, please give the video a like if you haven't already. Make sure you click that little subscribe button below. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Paul and I'll see you later. Cheers.